Hi, welcome to my presentation. So today I'm going to talk about our accepted paper on USENIX, systemization of knowledge in accessible and insecure, and exposition of authentication challenges faced by blind and visually impaired users in state-of-the-art academic proposals. My name is Mojibur Rahman Redoy Akanda, my co-author Amanda Lacy, our supervisor Nitesh Saxena. We're from Texas A&M University. So before going to the main presentation, I'm going to talk about some background. So what is authentication mechanisms? So authentication mechanisms verifies user identity before allowing access to online account. There are different type of authentication mechanisms. Single factor authentication that requires only user ID and password to get authenticated, and two-factor authentication that requires two-factor. That's mean, for example, user ID and password along with one-time password or OTP. And multi-factor authentication that requires two or more factors for authentication. That's mean user need to provide two or more factors for authentication and get access to online account. Now, the question is that, are these mechanisms secure? No, actually, cyber criminals are continuously introducing emerging attacks to break those authentication mechanisms and get unauthorized access to user online account. And to defend these attacks, researchers also introducing newer authentication mechanisms, including login terminal interaction, user-assisted authentication, automatic authentication, behavioral authentication. Now, a question is that do these methods consider diverse users in mind? I mean, when they developed to defend attacks, do they consider diverse users like screen reader assisted users, blind and visually impaired screen reader assisted users? Because these peoples are not very few. 2.2 billion people in the world have some sort of vision related problem right now. Among them, 1.2 billion problems are incurable. And they are using online accounts, and they are doing job in different company, different organization, using screen readers and other assistive technologies. The problem is that if an attacker compromises such users within an organization, then this could lead to severe organizational data breaches as the user is an insider. Now, some researchers also introduced authentication mechanisms dedicated for these users, including typing on terminal, gesture-based authentication, vibration-based authentication, behavioral authentication, and special hardware-based authentication. Now, a big question is that even if they are dedicated for blind and visually impaired users, are these mechanisms accessible and secure against diverse or emerging attacks? So to find this out, our contribution is here, where we have selected 50 authentication mechanisms proposed by a researcher. And among them, there are 37 general purpose authentication methods and 13 specifically dedicated authentication mechanisms for blind and visually impaired users. We have created a framework called ALESA framework, consisting 5 accessibility and 8 security metrics to evaluate the security and accessibility of proposed methods. And then we have systematically evaluated each of the authentication proposal by using against the ALESA framework's metrics by using a codebook. So here is the outline of my presentation. So first I'm going to talk about the selection of authentication methods. So to select authentication methods, we have start searching online First, we have searched for general authentication, where we have used a keyword like two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication methods and systems. To search dedicated authentication schemes, we have specified the keyword here. So authentication method for blind and visually impaired users, or two-factor authentication for blind and visually impaired users. And initially we have screen title and abstract, and we have removed those authentication mechanism, those paper that is not a authentication mechanisms paper, rather authentication analysis or study or review paper. And in the second phase, we performed an in-depth screening on abstract methodology, authentication workflow, and full text. And we try to find if the authentication workflow is implemented or illustrated and tested either technically or with participants. So if an authentication mechanism passes these criteria, then we move to the second step. Either we removed them. So in the second step, we try to find that the reputation of the venue or citation count more than or equal 10 or relevance of the authentication methods. So if any of the criteria meet, then we move to select them, either we removed them. And after selecting them, we have categorized them based on the user interaction, like typing on terminal, automatic, gesture-based authentication, or vibration-based authentication. And now I'm going to talk about the ALESA framework. So here we have prepared this ALESA framework with 5 accessibility and 8 security metrics. We adopted from Bonio et al. And explain them from the perspective of blind and visually impaired users. So when we select them, we actually expand the framework. So when we select any of the metrics from in there, we try to find out why this is important for these users and how this will impact based on the existing literature also. So like when we select presence of accessible interface, so we try to find out why this is important. So this is important for blind and visually impaired users because without accessible interface, screen reader will not be able to communicate any screen information to user, and this is very important for authentication. Either they won't be able to perform authentication. And also when we select any attack, we try to find out what is the general authentication attack and how this is specifically problematic for blind and visually impaired users. And now I'm going to talk about the application of those metrics on authentication methods. To apply those metrics and find out the adherence, non-adherence, or partially adherence, we used a code book, which includes code, that's mean matrix name, and definition, that's mean a small explanation of the metric, and what we specifically look for in the paper. That's mean if we try to find out if authentication mechanisms compatible with screen reader, then we try to find out if in the paper anywhere it is mentioned about screen reader or anything related. And we've also provided in the codebook an example indicator that provide evaluator a glimpse that how or what need to be searched on the paper. So like this, so we provide input authentication mechanisms and we search for the criteria provided in the codebook, and we finally try to find adherence, non-adherence, or partial adherence of metrics on authentication mechanisms and results. So now actually we found many problems on results. So problems on existing authentication mechanisms. So when we've tried to find out the accessibility evaluation of general methods, we found that most of the authentication mechanisms are inaccessible from the perspective of blind and visually impaired users. Only we found that automatic schemes are easy to perform authentication because they doesn't require any user interaction. Also, they manage timeout. And other authentication schemes from this selection actually failed in most of the metrics, accessibility metrics. And if I talk about security evaluation of general methods, then we found that it performs average. Like, despite being inaccessible, it provides a little bit of security, but still it has failed on most of the cases from the perspective of these users. And now, if I talk about the dedicated authentication schemes, then the scenario is really bad, actually. It provides a little bit better accessibility from the comparing to a general authentication, but it actually shows that even if they are dedicated for blind and visually impaired users, still they didn't mention anything about screen reader compatibility for some schemes. And also we found that only 4 authentication mechanisms user study found them accessible, and out of 10, other 6 provides inaccessibility feedback from users. And for security of dedicated authentication schemes, we found that they are really insecure, even if there are some accessibility metrics, but matched, but still they provide very few security features on them, and they are insecure for most of the attacks from the perspective of these users. Even if they mention that they are secure against shoulder surfing, but still we found that they are insecure against those shoulder surfing attacks. And now I'm going to talk about the broader takeaways and lesson learned from the evaluation. So we found that despite a broader user focus, general authentication schemes often overlooked diverse users. And automatic authentication schemes easy for authentication, but they shows vulnerable against shoulder surfing, device theft, and concurrency attacks. And we also found that schemes designed for blind and visually impaired users, but they did not meet the criteria of blind and visually impaired users in terms of accessibility and security. And also, we found that there is an imbalance between accessibility and security. That's when the authentication schemes accessible is less secure, and if it is secure, then it's less accessible. And finally, we also found that many vulnerabilities in these schemes arise from how screen reader interaction is performed with authentication schemes. And now if I'm going to talk about limitation, so we can see that actually we have dedicatedly focused on blind and visually impaired users, but screen reader is also used by other diverse users like ADHD, dyslexia. But actually, we have mentioned in the paper that how future researchers can expand our framework and expand this research for other users like ADHD, dyslexia, motor impairment, older adult. And for mitigation, we have actually proposed that integrating AI or OS level support is needed to detect phishing, malicious link, flagging malicious link, or and identify concurrent authentication prompt to mitigate this accessibility-driven security risk. And we also propose that there is an option to, there is a must need to develop inclusive authentication mechanisms for all. And future work could actually validate the findings for other user and expand the framework for other assistive technology and other impairment like cognitive or motor impairment. And conclusion is that like current academic authentication schemes often fail blind and visually impaired users due to poor accessibility and security design. The ALESA framework exposes these gaps, urging future work on real-world validation and inclusive secure authentication solution. Thank you so much for listening my presentation. Thank you.